And now, a passage from The Story of Arizona by Will Henry Robertson, from Chapter 16, Saloons and Bad Men. It has been said that most Arizona towns began with the opening of a saloon to supply the necessities of life. Later, a grocery store would be started to furnish the luxuries. Possibly the idea that this statement intended to convey was that in Pioneer, Arizona, the saloon was not only the poor man's club, but almost every man's club. And when the rear section of it was occupied by the usual Chinese restaurant, it came perilously near being many men's home as well. We naturally are not commending the custom, we simply record the historic fact. Within the saloon were gaming tables. It is not strange that so many of Arizona's early citizens were gamblers in one form or another. An old pioneer friend of ours says they couldn't help being that every time a miner visited his shaft, every time a cowboy went out after a bunch of cattle, every time a traveler started on a journey, he gambled his paycheck or hope of profit against his life. In the earlier days, poker and Monte were the favorite saloon games, but later, in such places as Brown's Congress Hall in Tucson or Gus Hirschfeld's Palace at Phoenix, the opportunities to contribute to that fickle jade, Miss Fortune, would include one or more faro layouts, a roulette table, a crap game, a keno corner, and perhaps a Chinese lottery. In these saloons, whose doors had no keys and whose nights were the principal parts of the days, there was always music, and a lady in a gown of carmine or sunset pink would place vocal gymnastics in competition with what was usually a very good orchestra composed of Mexicans who played entirely by ear. The most popular game at the Palace was faro, where the seats about the table would always be full, with more men standing behind. One queer rule of etiquette was that while social proprieties would not admit a Negro playing with the whites at faro, a Chinaman would be admitted upon perfect equality. There the long-queued celestial would sit by the hour, and, whether winning or losing, his face would have all the facile mobility of expression of a granite tombstone. The colored customers would play craps, and the mixed, unopulent clientele of the house, black and tan and white, who wished to indulge their gambling proclivities with small risk, concerned themselves at keno. Roulette seemed to hold special attraction for the tenderfoot who had money to burn and didn't mind the smell of smoke. In consequence, more than one gentleman from east of the Mississippi was reduced from opulence to penury in a single evening, due to the unfortunate dropping of a small ball on the wrong color and number of a wheel. Occasionally, of course, a player would make a big winning, which would be widely heralded, and which would result in increased playing at all of the tables. There were many reasons why the owners of the tables found their calling a lucrative one. The two basic reasons are these. First, all games have a certain percentage in favor of the dealers. Second, 99 men out of 100 sooner or later come back to the game if they win, and every man has to stop playing when he is broke. Indeed, the average laborer when he came to town did not expect to win with any consistency. His business in town was to blow in his paycheck or his gold dust, and he expected to go back penniless to the hills or his job when his fling was over. So it happened in every town of any size. The workers supported a group of affable, well-mannered, cool-eyed, cool-fingered, law-abiding gentlemen who dressed well and were good spenders at the expense of others. In the big places, the dealers worked in shifts of 4 hours at a time, the 24 hours through. As told by Captain Bork, "Isn't it rather late for you to be open?" asked the tenderfoot arrival from the east, as, at Tucson, he descended from the El Paso stage about 4 o'clock in the morning, and dragged himself to the bar to get something to wash the dust out of his throat. "Well, it is kinder late for the night afore last," genially replied the bartender, "but's jest in the shank of the evening for tonight." From the saloon to the professional bad man of the country is an easy transition, as the saloon was the parade ground where the bad man strutted. Sometimes, however, he would be spurious, and his bluff was soon called. Again we quote Bork, who lived in Tucson in the early 70s. A wild-eyed youth, thoroughly saturated with sheep-herder's delight and other choice vintages of the country, made his appearance in the bar of Congress Hall, and announcing himself as Slapjack Billy, the pride of the Panhandle, went on to inform a doubting world that he could whip his weight in bar meat. "Fur berluds me color," It carries me corfin on my back. Nhaman o postal balls be jingo. Is music in me ears. Thump sounded the brawny fist of Shorty Henderson, and down went Ajax, struck by the offended lightning. When he came to, the pride of the Panhandle had something of a job in rubbing down the lump about as big as a goose egg, which had suddenly and spontaneously grown under his left jaw. But he bore no malice, and so expressed himself. "Podners," he smiled, "this here's the most sociablest crowd I ever struck. Let's all 'ave a drink." Another story Bork tells is of ex-Marshal Duffield of Tucson, who is credited with having slain 13 undesirable citizens. This may have been true, for Duffield was brave enough to wear a plug hat in Tucson in the early 70s, and to a man who had nerve enough to do that, encounters with a baker's dozen of gunmen would be mere pistol practice. One day a certain Waco Bill arrived on a wagon train from Los Angeles, and being 3/4 full of a fluid Captain Bork denotes as coffin varnish, he desired to meet and overcome the celebrated guardian of the peace. "Whar's Duffer?" he hiccuped, as he approached the little group of which Duffield was the central figure. "I want Duffer. He's my meat." Whoop! The words had hardly left his mouth before something shot out from Duffield's right shoulder. It was that awful fist, which could upon emergency have felled an ox, and down went our Texan sprawling upon the ground. No sooner had he touched Mother Earth than, true to his Texan instincts, his hand sought his revolver, and partly drew it out of the holster. Duffield retained his preternatural calmness, and did not raise his voice above a whisper the whole time that his drunken opponent was hurling all kinds of anathemas at him. But now he saw that something must be done. In Arizona, it was not customary to pull a pistol upon a man. That was regarded as an act both unchristian-like and wasteful of time. Arizonans nearly always shot out of the pocket without drawing their weapons at all, and into Mr. Waco Bill's groin went the sure bullet of the man who local wits used to say wore crape upon his hat in memory of his departed virtues. The bullet struck, and Duffield bent over with a most Chesterfieldian bow and wave of the hand. "My name's Duffield, sir," he said, "and them 'ere's me visiting card." There were other outlaws within the territory of very different stripe than Waco Bill or the pride of the Panhandle. There were years, like those preceding and during the early part of the Civil War, when much of Arizona was practically without law, and therefore a refuge for all kinds of desperadoes from other localities. Those were the times when it was said that the California Vigilance Committee and the peace officers of Texas were the most zealous immigrant agents Arizona ever had. Many conditions in Arizona served to encourage the vicious deeds of crime. The border was infested with Mexican outlaws, and a robbery committed by them at an isolated miner's cabin, if accompanied by murder, might easily be laid at the door of the Indians, while innocent Mexicans in turn were accused of crimes committed by vicious criminal whites. Bullion was often carried across lonely stretches of desert or mountain on stagecoaches, where holdups were all too frequent. In 1879, the Phoenix stage was robbed 4 times within 4 months. In 1882, the pack train which carried mail and express across the Pinal Mountains into Globe was held up, the express messenger killed, and $10,000 in gold stolen. In Bisbee in 83, 5 desperadoes early in the evening entered the store of Goldwater and Castaneda, robbed the safe, and in escaping, shot and killed at least 4 people. In 89, a female who called herself Pearl Hart, with a man by the name of Joe Boot, robbed a stage in Cane Springs Canyon. Although there was an abundance of evidence against her, 12 sentimental pioneers declined to convict a perfect lady of stage robbery, and immediately thereafter were dismissed for the term with caustic and uncomplimentary remarks from Judge Doane upon their action. A succeeding jury convicted Miss Hart on the charge of taking the stage driver's revolver, for which crime she was sent to the penitentiary. While, as a whole, the peace officers of the state have been capable, fearless, and energetic men, in a few conspicuous instances they seem to have been chosen on the theory that it takes one desperado to capture another. A celebrated case of the criminally inclined officer is found in the story of the Earps of Tombstone. In the early 80s, when lawlessness in southern Arizona was worse than it had been for many years, Virgil Earps was city marshal of Tombstone, and Wyatt Earps was deputy United States marshal. This in spite of the fact that both of them were professional gamblers, and were suspected of either planning or participating in at least 2 stage holdups. Associated with Virgil and Wyatt were Morgan and Jim Earps and Doc Holliday, who, although he hung out a dentist's sign, had gambling for a vocation and manslaughter for an avocation. Bitter enemies of the Earps were the Clanton Cowboys of the Babacamari Mountains. One night in October 1888, Virgil had arrested Ike Clanton on the charge of disorderly conduct, though it appeared that the arrest was simply made as a declaration of war upon the Clanton gang. Seeming to appreciate the great advantage that being peace officers gave the Earps, and so desiring to postpone hostilities until a more auspicious occasion, the following morning Billy and Ike Clanton, with Frank and Tom McLaury, 2 other members of their gang, saddled their horses preparatory for leaving town. As they came out of the OK Corral, they were met by the 4 Earps and Doc Holliday, all heavily armed. The Earps opened battle at once, shooting and killing Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury, while Morgan Earps and Virgil received flesh wounds. The Earps at once gave themselves up to friendly authorities, who promptly dismissed them. The Clantons plotted vengeance. Soon after, Virgil Earps was shot from ambush, but got off with a wounded arm. Morgan Earps was not so lucky, for one night, while in a saloon, he was shot to death by a man hidden in the darkness, his assailant firing through a rear glass door. Without going into details of the subsequent events, it may simply be said that Frank Stillwell, an enemy of the Earps and a friend of the Clantons, was killed, supposedly by the Earps, at Tucson. Later they resisted an officer at Tombstone who had a warrant for their arrest, took to the hills and killed a Mexican in the Dragoon Mountains. Afterwards they fled into Colorado, where for some unexplainable reason Governor Pitkins refused to grant requisition papers from Arizona for their arrest. The most sanguinary feud ever known in the state was that between the Grahams and the Tewksburys in Tonto Basin in 86 to 87. The basin was a cattle country, but in 86 or earlier sheep were driven from the north and herded under the protection of the Tewksbury brothers. The Grahams, who were cattlemen, resented this action, and gave various hints to the sheep herders that a continued residence in Tonto Basin would doubtless undermine their health. Some of these hints, given after dark, took the form of bullets, which would go singing through the herder's frying pan as he fried his bacon for supper. However, when frightened herders fled, others were put in their places, and soon open warfare was proclaimed by the Grahams. John Tewksbury and a man by the name of Jacobs were running sheep on shares. One day both were ambushed near the Tewksbury house and killed. Then, keeping the rest of the Tewksbury family away by a fusillade of bullets from their hiding place among the rocks, the assailants allowed the bodies to be devoured by hogs. This was sowing Dragon's teeth with a vengeance, and resulted in a bloody harvest of 23 of the Graham faction killed, and 4 of the Tewksburys. 3 of the Grahams were hanged by their enemies on the rim of the Mogollons. Most of the others were shot from ambush. The last to be killed was Tom Graham. With most of his faction gone, and knowing that the threat of the Tewksburys to get him if he stayed would be surely carried out, Tom fled to the Salt River Valley. The writer ate breakfast with him in the morning when, after an all-night's ride, he arrived in Phoenix. "They sure would have got me if I'd stayed," he said, "and they may get me yet." What he feared came to pass. He was shot and killed from ambush as he was hauling a load of grain from a ranch he had bought in the valley to Tempe. 2 young women who saw the deed testified that Ed Tewksbury was one of the murderers. John Rhodes, one of the Tewksbury gang, and Ed Tewksbury were arrested. At the preliminary hearing, Graham's widow attempted to shoot Rhodes, but failed. Rhodes was discharged, Tewksbury was convicted, but on a technicality a new trial was granted when the jury disagreed. While these are conspicuous instances, there were many other acts of violence which occurred about that time, the situation becoming so serious that, in a message to the legislature, Governor F.A. Tritle called its attention to the thefts, murders, and general lawlessness specially prevailing in the southern part of the territory. The President of the United States was petitioned to ask Congress for an appropriation of $150,000 to be used in the establishment of mounted rangers to protect the state from criminals and Indians. Of all the crimes committed in the Southwest, none has been given more publicity than the holdup and robbery of Major J.W. Wham in 1889. On May 11th of that year, Major Wham was driving from Fort Grant to Fort Thomas, carrying with him $26,000 in gold, to pay the Fort Thomas soldiers. With him were 11 colored infantrymen and a sergeant. When the party entered a gulch just beyond Cedar Springs, they found their way blocked by a large boulder. Several of the soldiers, while attempting to get the rock out of the way, were surprised by a volley of shots coming from the hillside. Unexpected as was the attack, the soldiers sought shelter in orderly fashion and started to return the fire. But upon seeing that the gallant major had turned tail and was flying down the road, and that the enemy was shooting from stone breastworks, they followed in their commander's wake, leaving the gold for the highwaymen to carry away at their leisure. 8 soldiers were wounded, but none seriously. An investigation was made by the military authorities, and within a short time, 8 prominent ranchers of the upper Gila Valley were arrested, including Dave Cunningham, Dave Rogers, Tom Lamb, Ed Lyman, and Wall Follett. The 3 Follets were soon dismissed, but the others were bound over for trial. The attorneys in the case were among the most prominent in the territory. Those for the defense were Marcus A. Smith, Arizona's delegate to Congress, and Ben Goodrich. The prosecuting attorney was Henry Jeffords. While the trial abounded in picturesque and exciting incidents, there is not room to enter into them here. Altogether, 165 witnesses were examined, but in the end, the jurors found the prisoners not guilty. The Arizona Rangers, which were organized in Arizona in 1901, at first numbered but 12 men, with Burton C. Mossman, a young, energetic cattleman, as captain. Dayton Graham of Cochise County was first lieutenant. Every member of the company was a picked man, of proven ability in handling criminals, and of unquestioned nerve and courage. An arrangement was entered into with Colonel Kosterlitsky, a commander of the Mexican Rurales, that the command of either might pursue criminals across the border. From the time of their organization, the Rangers proved their value to the state, not only in capturing many desperate criminals, but their activity in pursuing the evildoers resulted in an exodus of many an undesirable citizen. In 1902, T.H. Rinning, former lieutenant of the Rough Riders, was appointed by Governor Brody to the captaincy of the Rangers to succeed Mossman, and like his predecessor, he made an able and efficient commander. By 1903, the company included 26 men, which, during the 6 years of its existence, arrested over 1,000 men charged with serious crimes, and 3 times that number for lesser offenses. Although not acting in an official capacity, one of the most picturesque of Rinning's acts happened in 1906. In the mining town of Cananea, south of the Mexican line, were living hundreds of Americans. In June, several thousand striking Mexican miners were terrorizing the camp. A lumber yard had been set on fire, 5 Americans and a number of Mexicans killed. With the consent of Governor Isabel of Sonora, Rinning led a force of 270 Americans into Cananea, and although they did not find it necessary to resort to arms, their presence greatly reassured the American inhabitants. In 1907, Rinning resigned to become superintendent of the territorial prison, and the captaincy of the Rangers went to Harry Wheeler, who later, while sheriff of Cochise County, became widely known through the active part he took in the deportation of the members of the IWW and others in the summer of 1917. The company of Rangers was discontinued in 1909 by an act of the legislature as a result of political quarrel between that body and Governor Kibbe.